second time preaching and
Hudson Taylor was an English medical missionary. Hudson Taylor was an English medical missionary to China during the last half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th. The organization that he started,
thank you so much, church, for giving me this opportunity and allowing me to stand here and share. So, as Pastor Gan already stated, that we're going to be studying. We'll try to gather something that will be beneficial to our spiritual life from the life of James Hudson Taylor. I don't know, how many of you have heard the name of James Hudson Taylor? Okay, very few of us, so that's good. Anyway, before we begin, I just have a question, okay? Think about it. Do you know how does Moses make his coffee? Huh? He brews it. That's true, yes, he brews it. Did you hear it before? Okay. How does Moses make his coffee? Coffee. Yes. He brews it, yes. That's the name of our Bible, so it's supposed to be a pun. Okay. Yeah. So last week we had heard from Pastor Chumlano on the title called End of Entitlement. That was from 1 Corinthians 9:1 through 18. And we heard and learned that, from the text, that if there was one person from that text who had the right to be entitled, that was Paul, right? But we know even more so, it's Jesus. Because Jesus let go of all his rights so that we would have redemption. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. So my sermon, my sharing is going to be, right, it's titled All Things to All People, James Hudson Taylor. So that's James Hudson Taylor. So yes. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. So we see somebody who laid down all his rights and entitlement. That is Jesus, And Paul is someone who walked on those estates. And in modern day Christianity, Hudson Taylor is one of the persons who really walked that walk with the Lord. And so much so that, so much so that there's a historian who called him, who said about Hudson Taylor that, this is about Hudson Taylor, okay? So he says, no other missionary in the 19th century since the Apostle Paul has had a wider vision and has carried out a more systematized plan of evangelizing a broad geographical area than Hudson Taylor. So how? We'll learn from that. We'll learn today. So let us just watch a small video so it gives you a little idea of who he is.
Hudson Taylor was an English medical missionary to China during the last half of the 19th century and early part of the 20th. The organization that he started, China Inland Mission, was a society responsible for bringing over hundreds of missionaries into the country, founded dozens of schools and missionary stations, and directly resulted in thousands of Chinese trusting Christ as their Savior. By the time he went home to be with the Lord in 1905, his systematic approach of evangelizing China had spread the good news of Jesus Christ all across the country. Hudson Taylor was born in Yorkshire in the United Kingdom in 1832, believed on the Lord Jesus Christ at age 17, and committed to go to China as a missionary. In 1851, he moved to a poor neighborhood to begin a medical apprenticeship and would routinely go tracting and street preaching there. The next year, he began his formal study of medicine in London, but in 1853 left school and departed for China, arriving in early 1854. When he realized that his blonde hair and large black overcoat received a poor reception, he dyed his hair, began to wear the traditional pigtail, and discarded his coat in favor of Chinese-style clothing. He said, "Let us in all things not sinful become like the Chinese, that by all means we might save some." He traveled great lengths across China and was never discouraged by things like robberies, the loss of his medical supplies, the death of loved ones, or civil war. In 1858, Taylor married Maria Dyer, welcomed their first child, Grace, in 1859, and took over operations at a hospital in Ningbo. In the 1860s, he translated the New Testament into a Chinese dialect for the British and Foreign Bible Society, co-wrote a book with his wife called China's Spiritual Need and Claims, and spent time in England speaking, asking for laborers into the Lord's field. Maria also gave birth to 3 more children. He also befriended George Mueller and Charles Spurgeon, who became supporters of China Inland Mission for the rest of their lives. In 1866, after 5 years in England, Taylor and his family sailed for China once again, this time to focus on the portions of China yet unreached with the gospel. In 1870, Maria went home to be with the Lord due to complications from childbirth, and Taylor took her loss so hard that he was forced to return to England for his health. Soon he remarried to Jenny Fulton, a fellow missionary to China, and they set sail together to return to the mission field. Throughout the 1870s, Taylor continued to travel throughout China, opening mission stations and training missionaries, and by 1881 there were 100 missionaries in the China Inland Mission. As the work of the Lord began to bring forth more fruit than ever in China, Taylor traveled to America to give testimony of what the Lord was doing. There he befriended D.L. Moody and C.I. Schofield, who became active supporters of China Inland Mission as well. Back in England, the famous cricket athlete C.T. Studd forsook all and committed his life to service in China, along with several Cambridge-educated friends of his. After a long life of service to the Lord, Jenny Taylor died in 1904, and soon after, Hudson Taylor sailed for China for the 11th and last time. He followed her home within a year. What a life of service. Does the story of your life sound anything like Hudson Taylor's? Why not talk to the Lord about how He can use you? Hudson
the gospel of Christ. So giving you a little background. I'm sorry, this is a little smaller. So just giving you a little backdrop. So James Hudson Taylor, he was a missionary to China. Yes, I said China, you know. So it was back in the 1900th century. And let me tell you what, giving a little backdrop of the China back then. So back in 1800 and 1900, China was not in a good condition. And 19th century is known as the century of humiliation for Chinese people. So why? So in the 18th and 19th century, Britain had a trade imbalance with China due to high demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain in Britain. While China required little from Britain in return, to correct this imbalance, the British East India Company began exporting opium. They were growing this opium in India because they already had a setup, you know, British East India Company, and they were like supporting this opium grown in India to China so they could make profit. But what was happening is people in China, Chinese people were getting addicted to it. And that's why, you know, it was bringing all the moral issues and all of that because people were like, you know, addicted now. So you can sense from this one that the British and the Chinese were not in good terms back then. And this is the time when Hudson Taylor, he was not the first, but this is the time when he decides where he feels called to go to China. Now Hudson Taylor, he was born in Barnsley, a place called Barnsley in England. His father was a pharmacist, and he was a Methodist lay preacher. And even before his birth, his parents had dedicated Hudson Taylor to the Lord. You know, and he was born in a Christian family. His father and mother would pay for him to go to China. But as he grew up, he disgraced from that one, you know. He was lost. You know, at the age of 15, he was working somewhere at a clergy, and then at 17, he didn't quite like it, so he quit it. And at the age of 17, he was very hopeless. And one day, he went to his father's library, and there, among so many books, he found a tract. He found a tract, and as he was reading it, his life was changed. And his conversion is really affected by the prayers of his mother and sister. His mother, so this is happening. So there is Hudson Taylor in a library reading the book, you know, reading the tract, you know, and being convicted. Whereas that very day, even before he went to that library, his mother went and locked herself in a room, and she started to pray. And she said, I'm not going to leave today until you hear my prayer. And, you know, she was praying, you know, and so you can imagine the two scenes, like scene 1 and scene 2, they're happening, you know. She's praying over here, and he's like in the library, whatever. And as soon as he feels convicted and gives his life to Jesus, that's the moment his mother feels, okay, your prayers are answered in her spirit, you know. And then, right after that, Hudson Taylor goes to his sister home, and there he finds a diary of his sister, where she writes down, you know, praying for him for 3 times a day. So his sister name was Amelia, and she would pray 3 times a day. So you can see the importance of prayer in its conversion. So while he was reading this tract, what really intrigued him was the phrase called the finished work of Christ. Like, you know, and then he was like, what is this? Like, why shouldn't it be like atoning work of Christ and all of that? And then in his autobiography, he says, the finished work of Christ, remembering the words, it is finished, he raised the question, what was finished? The answer seemed to fall in place, and he received Christ as his Savior. Yes, so this very word, the finished work of Christ, I think we all are here because of the finished work of Christ. There's nothing to add to that. So, you know, that is what really intrigued him, because he was like, you know, what should I do? Like, you know, to make my life meaningful and all of that. But he then realized, it's only the work of Christ, and he doesn't need to add to that. So Hudson Taylor, he went to China, and let me give you in numbers like his influence. What was his influence? So he served in China for 51 years, and he started something called China Inland Mission, CIM. It's called Inland Mission. You might be wondering, why is it called inland? Because China is a small country, right? I think so. It's very big. Yes, it's very big. China is very big. And there were so many places where the gospel had not reached. So it's called inland, inside the land, So there were so many provinces where the missionaries who had gone before him had not reached. So that's why he started China Inland Missions. He trained 700 Christian workers. He raised $4 million by faith. Totally by faith. He didn't solicit anyone because he followed George Mueller's principle, not asking people. That is his walk, okay? And developed a witnessing Chinese church of 1,25,000. It has been said at least 35,000 were his own converts, and he baptized around 50,000 people. So you can imagine, 50,000 people in all his life, he baptized. So this is how his journey began, in hopelessness and all of that. He found the Christ, and then his life was changed. And soon after his life, soon after he received Christ, he was all sold for Jesus Christ. He started to learn about Chinese culture, and back then there was only one book available, and then he goes and asks this person, and he gets that book, and he starts reading his book and everything on China. And not just that, thank you. And he really trained himself for the mission. He knew it was not going to be easy. He started to live, he also started to practice with a doctor because he knew he could serve in China as a doctor because there was a lot of need for that one. So he started to practice with doctor, and on the other time he would go and preach the gospel. And one day God also convicted his heart, that tithing is indeed important. So what he does, he lives in a quite good house, then he leaves that house, he goes to a different place, then he begins to live in quite like, in a almost like a slum side, and then he sleeps on the floor. He only eats bread and water. So all of this he did so that his heart would be prepared for what he was about to embark on, because he knew that was not going to be easy. So he was self-disciplining himself and all of that even before. And, God really uses small and big circumstances to teach us many lessons. He knows how much we can take. So, sometimes we're like, why is it not happening? Where is God in it? And we're, talking about goodness of God. And when I look back last year, this is not the place where I am at today. I was like, maybe God is not good and all of that, and we can feel that, in those moments. But God really knows how to teach us. He really knows how to prepare us. God knew that his mission in China was not going to be easy one. It was going to be very difficult, and so God was already preparing him. And at one instance where Hudson Taylor, he gets invited to come and pray for this lady. And actually the man comes and says, Hudson Taylor, would you please come and pray for my wife? And Hudson Taylor is like, why do you want me to come and pray for you? There are other priests. Why don't you call them? And he says, no, I cannot afford. I need to pay them money if the other priests come. So then Hudson Taylor goes, and he prays. And he sees there like 6 children in a poor neighborhood. And then Hudson Taylor begins to pray, and as soon as he closes his eyes, and then he hears the voice, hypocrite. It's quite drastic, eh? Why? Let me give you what. Because they were in so much need. They were in so much need. And then he had just 1 silver coin. That's all he had. And that was just going to be enough for like 1 meal or 2 meal. But then when he saw those needs, he was like, maybe I should just keep it with me. This is for me, right? Let me just pray and be done with it. But when he starts to pray, he's like, God is like, hypocrite. Like, then he opens his eyes, and then he's like, he puts his hand in his pocket, he takes out that coin and gives it to that family. And the other day, the other day was not supposed to, so on that, it was Monday, so on that day, he doesn't usually get any post. So, but on that day, he receives the post in which there is a coin. And that coin is almost like 10 times more than what he had given to that family. So God really started to teach him how to live by faith.
Hudson Taylor.
So that's China in the 19th century. And so even before he went to China, he learns about servanthood. And one of my favorite authors called John Ortberg, he likes to say, the primary reason Jesus calls us to servanthood is not because other people need our service, which is true, they do need, but it is because of what happens to us when we serve. Because our hearts are changed when we serve others. Then we realize, it's really not my resources. It's not really my money. It's not really my strength. It's not really my education, And when we serve with that heart, he really changes it, because, yes, people do need. There's a need and all of that. But more than that, it's because so that God would, change our lives. And this is what Hudson Taylor was being taught by God, even before he went to China. Now we will see, in the beginning I told you, right, his life, there's just so much to learn from his life. But I'm just going to barely going to be scratching the surface. I'm just going to give you some few events and all of that. But I really encourage you to go back home and, there are so many resources in the internet. You can maybe buy a book or something and, you can read it. And there's just so much to take from that one. Yeah. So he was convinced when he was young that he was being called to China. So in September 1853, he was aged 21, and that's when he sailed to China under the auspices of China Evangelical Society. So this CES, Chinese Evangelical Society, was very active back in China. So that was his first mission. In total, he did 7 voyages to China. And let me tell you, it might have taken 5 to 6 years, because one voyage would be 5 months or something, So he basically spent like 5 to 6 years traveling, just in case your patao comes 5 minutes late. He really spent that amount of time, because he was called to that. And not just that, first time when he was going to China, he was almost about to be shipwrecked twice. He could have died there, but the Lord saved him. It says there, it took him 6 months, and he arrived in Shanghai in March 1854. So he started in 1853, and he reaches in 1854. So that's like 5 and around 6 months it took him to get there. First time when he went there. So, back then I told you, in the beginning I had given you the backdrop of how, Chinese people were not liked. The British were not liked in China. Why? Because of that opium trade that was happening and all. So when he went there, people called him different names. They persecuted him. They called him Black Devil, because he was wearing those black overcoat. As you can see, a lot of Brits, they like to wear black overcoat because it's very cold there. So they would call him Black Devil, And then he realized, I need to get into the culture and understand the culture, and how he adopted the culture. He allowed his hair to grow big. He he was using, he would put that pigtail, it's called kuai in Chinese language. So he pretty much then started to look like Chinese. He adopted because he really loved China, because he knew he was called to China. So upon arrival, Taylor faced numerous challenges, including illness, hostility from locals, and the difficulties of adjusting to a new culture. Despite these hardships, he persisted in his mission. So what were his initial missionary efforts? So what he did was like I told you, he adopted the Chinese culture, which was really important, and then because he knew that he could serve well in China through the medical work, he was also being trained. He was under a doctor, so he trained himself in that. So he combined preaching with medical assistance, treating diseases like cholera and smallpox, which opened doors for sharing the gospel. He knew how to get to them, So he was there, serving the Lord. It was not easy. So in one instance, I'll tell you how unreached that place was. This is an excerpt from his autobiography where he says, "On one occasion, I was preaching the glad tidings of salvation through the finished work of Christ, when a middle-aged man stood up and testified before his assembled countrymen to his faith in the power of the gospel. I have long sought for this truth." So this man is saying, I have long sought for this truth, said he earnestly, as my father did before me, but I have never found it. I have traveled far and near, but without obtaining it. I have found no rest in Confucianism, so that is the religion back in China, and Buddhism or Taoism, but I do find rest in what I have heard here tonight. Henceforth, I am a believer in Christ. So this is while Hudson Taylor was preaching, and somebody's standing up and telling him, testifying. And Hudson Taylor in disbelief says, "What?" said he, amazed. "Is it possible that for hundreds of years you have had the knowledge of these glad tidings in your possession and yet have only now come to preach it to us? My father sought after the truth for some more than 20 years and died without finding it. Oh, why did you not come sooner?" There were people who had died without the gospel. So this was a dire need, and he knew it. So back in China, Hudson Taylor is doing ministry and all of that. So he had changed himself. He was, he pretty much looked like a Chinese now, And then this was not liked by the ministry, the organization that had sent him. They really despised him and all. So then he realized that he had to, respectfully quit this ministry, and he had to start. So he was disillusioned by the limitation of existing missionary societies. Taylor envisioned an organization dedicated to evangelizing China's vast interior, where few missionaries have ventured. So he knew, so there were also inlands, small provinces, deep inside, because China is a very big country, right? And he knew that he had to go there and preach the gospel. And on June 25, 1865, Taylor formally established the China Inland Mission. He appealed to Christians in Britain for support, emphasizing faith-based funding without soliciting donations, relying solely on prayer and God's provision. So his thing was we're not going to soliciting anyone. We're going to just live by faith, But he was encouraging, he was telling about his missions and all of that. So first missionaries, Taylor's charismatic appeal and unwavering faith inspired many. By 1868, he returned to China with a party of 24 missions, including his family. So, he was going back and forth because he saw there was so much need, and, so he would go back and try to get the support that he needed and would come back. And what were his approaches? We say loving well, and this is something that I've been learning. We say sometimes it's not just loving people; it's about loving well. And when you want to love them well, you would try to understand what this person likes and doesn't like, what I should say and what I should not say. Because it's not just about loving is about loving well. So he knew if the gospel had to be reached, then he would have to change the traditional ways and all, So, some of his innovative mission strategies were like, he had like non-denominational approach. Like, he would not associate. For him, there was no denomination. So CIM, China Inland Mission, it was open to missionaries from various denominational background, focusing on unity and common purpose. So he was not like an isolated, mission or whatever he was doing. He was working in conjunction with other people. Okay, so he had this non-denominational approach, and also he included women, and we see how he really heard God. Like, when we read the Bible, we see that, how Jesus like really lifted up women. Like, he really allowed them to partake with him in ministry. Like, and he followed that. Today, Taylor was a pioneer in recognizing the contribution of single women in missionary work, allowing them to serve independently. And his faith principle was, CIM operated on the principle of living by faith without guaranteeing salaries of fundraising campaigns, which required immense trust in God provision. So can you imagine, which almost sounds very absurd in today's context, like how would we do a mission, without raising support or whatever. But this is what he lived by. So, so he was in China for 54 years. He went back and forth. He had many hurdles. He went through a lot. After 12 years of marriage, he lost his wife, Maria Dyer. He had 8 children, and out of 8, only 4 of them had survived. So he lost them. So he really went through a lot. I mean, like I told you, right? There is like so many instances where he would cry unto God, and he would even be like, do you really want me to be here? Like, how do I do this? Because by now you already know what he did in China. He really shared the gospel. So many lives were changed. He baptized 50,000 people, which is not a small number. His influence was great, And in later years of his life, what he did, he traveled extensively because he knew it was not his work and he couldn't do it alone. So, he wanted other people to be on board. So he would, he traveled in America, Australia, so many churches in England, asking people, encouraging them to come and serve the Lord back in China. So he traveled really extensively, advocating for the missionary cause and raising awareness about the needs in China. And his influence was so great. How? We know. So there was a professional cricket player. Do you like cricket? How many? No? Nobody knows cricket? Okay, I think, oh, yes. so there are. And now it's coming up in Nepal, right? So there was a professional cricket player, C.T. Sturds. He was influenced by when he saw what God was doing back in China, how lives were being saved, so there were so many people who came on board, and one of them was C.T. Sturds. He was a professional cricket player. He gave up that profession to come and serve with CIM in China. And not just that, there was also a group of people called Cambridge 7. So they were learned people in Cambridge, because you went everywhere telling them about what is happening in China and why you should come and all of that. So there were 7 also other people, intellectual people who left their career to come to China and to serve alongside. Later he had also remarried because his first wife, Maria, she died, only 12 years of marriage. And then he married another woman who also went on to be with the Lord due to cancer. And a year after that, Hudson Taylor also died in June 3, 1905 in Changsha. He was buried in the English cemetery there. So he was buried in the same cemetery where his first wife was there. So he was in Switzerland They both were in Switzerland, and his wife dies of cancer. Then he comes back to China again, where his daughter from second wife, they were serving. So he dies when he comes in 1904. He dies in 1905. He died in China. He knew what he was called for. He began his journey, and then, so he lived a very radical life in entrusting the Lord. You know, I told you, like, when you think about it, it's almost like, what's big about, like, you know, not asking for support or whatever. But it's very difficult to run a ministry. Like, you know, there were so many persecutions. There were so many times that was shipwrecked, you know, and there were other revolutions that were already going in China, and this would affect. And once, I forgot the numbers, but he almost lost more than 50 plus of his missionaries, including children as well. So health concerns led him to return to Switzerland, and in 1902, Taylor returned over leadership of the mission to D.E. Hostes. So during his last year, he had already passed on the leadership of CIM, China Inland Mission. And in 1904, Jenny died of cancer at 60 years old. And in the year following, Taylor set off for his 11th and final voyages to China. Taylor's travels took him to Changsha, the capital of the Hunan province, the most impenetrable of the 9 evangelized provinces. He died peacefully and quietly on June 3, 1905, in the home of his daughter-in-law, not long before the country would again close under communist rule later in the 20th century. Nevertheless, in just 2 years from the China would see more than 800 Christian missionaries ministering in its interior. So he ran the race very well. You know, so he was all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. He was everything. He was a diligent person who lived a life of discipline. You know, he was a very smart person as well. He learned medicine. He learned Chinese medicine, you know, and he taught himself photography. He used to do photography as well, and you know, and he also knew how to make his own plates and prints. He was a musician as well, and he was also expert in hunting. So you see this man, like, you know, and all of this talent that he had he used all of that for God radically. You know, I think in 2022, while Pastor Gyan was preaching, I had this in my note, and I was like, you know, where he says, you know, a radical lifestyle begins with a surrender to the ownership of the Lord over all we are and all we have. You know, when we surrender all we have and all we are, God really uses that. So that's why it was very encouraging for me when I was hearing the story, you know, and try to, like, gather the whatever, you know, for the sharing today, that he lived a life of faith. But having said that, it is not as if there were not setbacks in his life. He did not always feel like it, you know, because when we read this, you know, about this man, we are like, oh wow, he did so many great things and all of that, right? But he also needed Christ so much. He was weak sometimes, you know. He couldn't take it on any longer, you know. Like I told you, his child dies, and soon after that, his wife dies. And you can imagine what would have happened to him, like the heartbreak, you know. And this is a letter, so that James Hudson Taylor is writing to his mom. So what he is saying is, you know, in this, I would like to read this for us. And so this is Hudson Taylor writing to his mom in his moment of weakness. The need for your prayer has never been greater than at present. Envied by some, despised by many, hated by others, often blamed for things I never had anything to do with. Often sick in bed, perplexed in mind, embarrassed by circumstances. Had not the Lord especially been gracious to me, had not my mind been sustained by the conviction that the work is His and that He is with me, I must have fainted or broken down. But the battle is the Lord's, and He will conquer. We may fail, do fail continually, but he never fails. I have continually to mourn that I follow at such a distance and learn so slowly to imitate my precious master. I cannot tell you how I am buffeted by the temptation. I never knew how bad my heart is, yet I do know that I love God and love His work and desire to serve Him only. And in all things, and I value above all else that precious Savior in whom alone I can be accepted. But often I am tempted to think that one so full of sin cannot be a child of God at all. May God help me to love Him more and serve Him better. So this is James Hudson Taylor writing to his mom. So he was in really low point, He went through a lot. And he's telling somebody who is so prone to sin, who is so prone to wonder of how can he be a child of God? How can he say that he loves? And then he says, may God help me to love Him more and serve Him better. Some of the gatherings that I had from this preaching was he really lived a life. So there was a big emphasis on prayer. There was a big emphasis on prayer. Like I told you, his mother and sister, they prayed continuously, and that brought about his conversion. Of course, God is the one who converts, who convicts, but they had a huge role to play in his life. And faith, we also heard how he didn't solicit any funds or whatever, he lived by faith in every instance. And he was very humble, When you trust in God, that is humility. Trusting in God is humility, When you let go of your rights. He could have said, God, I am serving you here in China. Why so much temptation? Why so much lack? Why so much disease? Why so much death? But no, he humbled himself. He went before the Lord. He did cry. He was not unreal. He poured out his heart, but he knew. That's why it's humble. It's humility when we are in pain, because pain can really lead us into a direction of, saying, God is not good, I must do something on my own. Or it can lead us to a direction where we can say, God, you are still good. I don't like it. This is painful, but you are still sovereign. And this is the path that Hudson Taylor took. And he was a man of discipline. He prayed to God. He read his Bible. In the last 40 years of his life, every year he would read the Bible once. I'm not saying that you need to finish a Bible in 1 year. But you see, these disciplines have really a great role in our life. They are there to make us. One author likes to say, disciplined people can do the right thing at the right time, in the right way, with the right spirit, for the right reason. So, and he lived a life of discipline. He really disciplined himself because he knew he would need that. And that is something that we lack as young people, So we really need that to live a life of discipline. And he also lived a life of prayer, like I told you, And prayer is something, I hear sometimes people say, oh, I don't know how to pray. There is genuine sincerity in that one, But, prayer is a learned behavior. We learn it. It just doesn't come to us naturally, So nobody is born an expert at it. No one ever masters prayer. And we can never master, it's not about words, it's about talking to God. And that's why the prayer had a huge, it was a huge support in his life. He really prayed to God. Oh, okay. So yes, he was all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. And we know he baptized 50,000 people. I'm just giving you a number. But he was always humble enough to say to God, use my life to save some people. And he was all things to all men, that he might by all means save some. We heard about this missionary life, and we also know, I don't know about you, but my life especially has really been affected by missionaries' life, who left and came back here to India, to Nepal. I was in India for 6 years. I think all of you know Michelle's sister. You know, she has a huge impact in my life. The way she, helped me walk in this spiritual journey. So there are so many people like who leave everything behind. And giving up our rights and entitlements is it is a privilege for God, because He deserves it all. Yes, I don't know about you, but I have been really blessed by missionaries' life. How they invest, they give themselves up, they sell themselves out for the work of the gospel. Um, and when we hear about such people, such great missionaries who have done so much, there are two responses. One, we can say, there's something that I can learn. I want my life to be like this, to some extent, or however. The other one is, oh, this is too good to be true. I'm not made for it. I just cannot. But I want to tell you today, because, am I worthy to preach about such a man? No, right? There's no way. I'm not even worthy to talk about him. But, as I was thinking, we all are missionaries. Who are missionaries? Missionaries are people who are on a mission. You can always be on a mission. When you are riding on a pathao, you can share the gospel if the conversation leads to up. And what I've realized is, you don't even have to sometimes force it. It just happens if you allow yourself to be in the hands of God. Where are you coming from? I'm coming from the church. Rather than saying I'm coming from Tamil. So then that person will be intrigued, what is this, So from his life, we get to learn that we are actually missionaries wherever we are set. When we treat somebody rightly, when we speak politely, when we speak gently, when we speak with love, that's when we are sharing the love of Christ. Because it's about having that mission. God is it's not someone's call, but it's everyone's call to be the salt and light. He says go and make disciples of all nations. So we can be in our workplace, when we study, through our actions, as young people, when we are in school, when we are in our colleges, when we are doing our exams, when everybody says, let's cheat, it's okay. Then you can say, no, I don't want to cheat. This does not honor God, and that's where the name of Father is glorified, So James Hudson, he really, I think he knew God in a different level. I can't even imagine, the way he knew God. And that's why I'm encouraged, do I really know Jesus as James Hudson Taylor? So this is a question that I want us to live with. Do we really know Jesus in the way Hudson Taylor did? So much so that he would spend all his life at the feet of Jesus. He gave himself up. His life, when he knew Christ, from that moment to until he breathed his last, it was all set out for Jesus. I'm not saying you need to go to China. Maybe God might call you for China. That's good. That's great, But in everyday life, how can you be the hands and feet of Jesus to the people around? So, and that's how we become a missionary. That's how we live on a mission every day. So this is encouragement for each one of us, from the life of Hudson Taylor. And I read this quote in a book, and with this I would like to end my sharing today. It shares no matter what we do here, no matter how we live life, married or single, childless or raising a herd of kids, doing an accounting job or digging wells in Africa, we do it to know God and to get Him. It's all about Jesus. May God bless us. Thank you.